In 1889, an American expedition from the University of Pennsylvania began cutting into a mound in southern Iraq at a place the ancients called Nibru, Nippur. They pulled thousands of clay tablets out of that dirt. Most of them were receipts, grain, barley, temple accounts. But on a handful of them was something else. A story about how human beings were made. And the story is not the one you'd expect. It isn't clean. It isn't a single act of will, light, and dust, and finished. It's a workshop. There are drafts. There are versions that do not work, a body whose hands will not close, a body that cannot hold its own water, a body with no sex organs at all, and each failure is examined, catalogued, and given a purpose. Then, on a separate tablet from the same tradition, the same gods produce a version that does work, and they produce it in a batch, 14 pieces of clay. 7 set on the right, 7 set on the left, 7 male, 7 female. Mass production. For 4,000 years that has been filed under mythology. Then, between 2012 and 2018, 3 laboratories in Seattle, in Dresden, in Santa Cruz, went looking for the exact genetic difference between a human being and every other primate alive. They were not looking for Sumerians. They were sequencing DNA. And what came back was a short list of genes that no other animal on Earth possesses. Genes that appear in our lineage abruptly. Genes that are broken photocopies of older genes. One of them sat dead in the genome for millions of years until a single letter changed and switched it on. I spent weeks on this one, and I want to walk you through both halves honestly, because the overlap is stranger than the internet version, and the debunk is stronger than you've been told. Start with the tablets, because everything depends on what they actually say. The composition is called Enki and Ninmah. The best copies are Old Babylonian, roughly 1900 to 1600 BCE, and they're catalogued under numbers like CBS 2168 in Philadelphia. The full translation is public. It sits in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, a project founded at Oxford in 1997 by Dr. Jeremy Black, not a fringe website, a university archive. Its companion text, the Atrahasis epic, survives in a copy dated by its own colophon to the reign of Ammi-Saduqa, Hammurabi's great-grandson, around 1646 BCE. These are real documents you can read tonight. Here's the accepted account of what they mean. The lesser gods are doing manual labor digging canals, dredging clay, piling silt. They mutiny. Ninmah, the primeval mother, wakes Enki, the god of wisdom, sleeping in the deep water, and tells him, "Please apply the skill deriving from your wisdom and create a substitute for the gods so that they can be freed from their toil." Enki's instruction is specific. Knead clay from the Abzu, have the birth goddesses nip off pieces. In Atrahasis, the recipe is even more precise. Kill one god, a god who had intelligence, and let the womb goddess mix clay with his flesh and blood. Then 14 pinches, 7 and 7, and a workforce exists. Standard ancient mythology. It sits on the shelf next to Prometheus. That's the reading. But here's where people started asking questions. Because after the humans are made, the tablet does something no other creation story does. Enki throws a banquet. And the text says, flatly, Enki and Ninmah drank beer. Their hearts became elated. Then Ninmah makes a boast that she can decide whether a body turns out good or bad, and Enki takes the bet. What follows is a list. First, a man who could not bend his outstretched weak hands. Second, one who turned back the light, blind. Third, one with both feet broken, one with paralyzed feet. Fourth, one who could not hold back his urine. Fifth, a woman who could not give birth. And sixth, read this one slowly, one with neither penis nor vagina on its body. 6 bodies. 6 specific failures of the motor system, the sensory system, the continence system, the reproductive system. And after each one, Enki inspects it and assigns it a function. Then he takes his own turn, produces something called umul, and Ninmah looks at it and says the most disturbing line on the tablet. The man you have fashioned is neither alive nor dead. Now hold that, because in February 2015, Marta Florio and Wieland Huttner at the Max Planck Institute in Dresden published in Science the discovery of a gene called R-HatGap11b. It is a partial duplicate of an older gene, and it exists in humans and in no other living animal. They put it into an embryonic mouse brain. Mouse brains are smooth. In half of all cases, the mouse cortex folded. In 2020, they repeated it in a marmoset fetus, and the monkey's neocortex grew larger and developed a fold, and Huttner's team deliberately terminated the pregnancies before birth on ethical grounds because they did not know what the animals would become. Then, in December 2016, the same lab found how it got switched on. The duplication happened roughly 5 million years ago and produced a useless fragment. Sometime later, between about 1.5 million and 500,000 years ago, a single base changed. One C became a G. That created a new splice site, deleted 55 letters from the message, and gave the protein a 47 amino acid tail that exists in no other species. Huttner's own words, tiny on a genomic scale but substantial in its functional and evolutionary consequences. That is not the only one. In 2012, 2 papers ran back-to-back in the same issue of Cell. Evan Eichler's lab at Washington and Frank Polyeu's group described SRGAP2C, another human-only duplicate, which dates to about 2.4 million years ago, precisely at the transition from Australopithecus to Homo, the moment stone tools appear. And in 2018, again in Cell, again back-to-back, 2 teams described Notch, 2NL, a broken pseudogene, dead in our ancestors and still dead in chimpanzees and gorillas, which in our lineage alone was repaired a working stretch of sequence copied over the damage between 4 and 3 million years ago. Delete it from human stem cells and grow a brain organoid, and the organoid comes out smaller. And what I haven't told you yet is the part of atrahasis almost nobody quotes. After humanity works, after it reproduces, after the population grows, the gods intervene a second time, not to destroy, to regulate. The text instructs that there shall now be, among the peoples, women who bear and women who do not bear, that a demon be installed to snatch the baby from the lap of her who bore it, and that 3 classes of priestess be established and declared taboo, and so stop childbirth. The scholar Anne Kilmer laid this out in Orientalia in 1972. The flood in this epic is not a punishment for sin. It is population control. And the epilogue is a permanent fertility management program. So here is the case, put as strongly as it can be. A 4,000-year-old text describes making a worker species by combining base material with the tissue of an existing intelligent being. It describes failed bodies. It describes production in batches. It describes reproduction as a dial the makers can turn up and down. And modern genetics finds that our brains were built by a small number of duplicated genes, unique to us, arriving in bursts, one of them activated by a single letter, one of them a corpse brought back to life. Even Francis Crick, who co-discovered the structure of DNA, published a paper in Icarus in 1973 called Directed Panspermia, arguing life may have been deliberately sent here. But before you say yes to any of this, here is the other side, and it is not weak. Nearly every version of this theory you have heard traces to one man, Zecharia Sitchin, who published The 12th Planet in 1976. Sitchin held a degree in economics and worked as a journalist. He had no training in Assyriology. Michael Heiser, who did PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from Wisconsin, spent 20 years documenting the problems. Anunnaki does not mean those who from heaven to earth came. It most likely means princely seed, offspring of An. The word contains no element meaning heaven, none meaning earth, and no verb of motion. Heiser counted 182 occurrences of the word in the Sumerian corpus and challenged anyone, publicly, to produce a single line linking them to a planet. Nobody did. Nibru, in the actual astronomical texts, is Jupiter, sometimes Mercury, and it was seen every year. And the 6 bodies? Assyriologists read that passage as a theodicy, not a lab report. Look again at what Enki actually does with each one. The blind one becomes a court musician, and blind court musicians are attested in Mesopotamian records across 3 millennia. The one with paralyzed feet becomes a silversmith, a seated, prestigious trade. The woman who cannot bear children enters the queen's household as a weaver, which maps onto the real Naditu institution. The one with no sex organs is named and placed before the king, and eunuchs held senior posts in Assyrian administration. 6 creations, 6 job placements. That is a society explaining why the blind man plays the lyre for the king. The clay is not evidence either. Egypt has Khnum shaping children on a potter's wheel. Greece has Prometheus with water and earth. China has Nuwa and yellow clay. Genesis has dust. Pottery was the highest manufacturing technology these people had. It's the only vocabulary of making they possessed. And the genes. Susumu Ono explained this in 1970. Duplication is the engine of evolutionary novelty. Lynch and Connery measured the rate in science about 1 duplication per 100 genes per million years. Over 6 million years since the chimp split, you'd expect thousands. And these 3 didn't land in brain genes because someone chose brains. They landed in 1q21, 1 and 1p12, the most structurally unstable neighborhoods in the genome. Regions that misalign and duplicate constantly. srgap2c is 9 exons of a 22-exon gene, a 2/5 complete fragment, whose entire function is to jam the original. Notch 2NL came bundled with a permanent fault line. It is the direct cause of 1q21, 1 deletion syndrome, producing microcephaly, macrocephaly, autism, and schizophrenia in living children right now. No engineer ships a feature that keeps breaking the product. Then there's the timing, and it is brutal. ARHGAP1, 1b, 5 million years. Notch 2NL, 4 to 3 million. SRGAP2C, 2.4 million. The chromosome fusion that took us from 48 chromosomes to 46, around 900,000 years. The oldest Homo sapiens fossils, from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, 315,000 years. The tablets, 1,600 BCE. Every single one of those genetic events happened before our species existed. Neanderthals and Denisovans carry them too. There was nobody there to engineer. And yet, there is a 118-letter stretch of DNA called HAR1, active in the developing human cortex. Between a chicken and a chimpanzee are 300 million years apart. It differs by 2 letters. Between a chimpanzee and us, 6 million years apart, it differs by 18. Something was hammering on that sequence, hard and only on our line. And notice what the tablets do not say. They never claim the first humans were sterile. That's Sitchin's invention. What the actual text says is the reverse, that we worked too well, bred too fast, and had to be throttled. That is the one detail nobody arguing this case would ever have made up, because it helps neither side. A Bronze Age scribe, writing in wet clay, chose to record that the makers of humanity had to go back in and limit how many of us there could be. Maybe 6 broken bodies on a tablet are just an ancient society's honest attempt to explain disability. Maybe 15 genes that no other creature on Earth has, arriving in bursts in the least stable corners of our genome, are exactly what 4 billion years of accident looks like. Or maybe the oldest written story we possess is a memory of the day the process worked, and we have simply never known how to read it. So which is it? A myth that got lucky, or a lab report that outlived its laboratory?